Welcome, everyone. For those of you who are joining us today, I can't see who all we have, but welcome, everyone. It's really nice to have you all. I'm sure you're familiar with me by now. My name is Steffen, and I'm the Senior Advisor to the Digital Transformation work at United Nations Environment Program. And we've been hosting these digital discovery sessions for quite a bit now, for most this entire year. And the intention behind these sessions is to create a conversation, a very open dialogue on the role that digital technologies, to explore the role that digital technologies can play in enabling sort of more sustainable outcomes across the world. Yes, this is our last session of the year. And yes, we will be back next year for sure. But this session, we're talking about something that most of us can relate with rather well, and that is consumption. We are a society that has become increasingly obsessed with consumption, to the point where if we all keep our consumption habits the way they are, we might need about 3 planet Earths by 2050. And I don't think that's a rather feasible option. So I think some things need to be done to mitigate that. And as we've explored over the last many sessions, digital technologies do have an opportunity to play a very critical role in enabling very interesting outcomes, enabling different pathways that can lead us towards more sustainability, particularly when it comes to switching our patterns of consumption that is premised on a very we produce, we consume, and then we waste, which is a linear economic pattern, to a more sort of regenerative, more circular economic pattern where we don't waste as much and we're careful about how we produce, how we consume, and how we let that cycle flow through. And to discuss these very interesting topics, I've got, I think, 2 thought leaders in the world, which I'm very excited to share this dialogue with. Steffen and Tim, who have recently launched a very exciting report, which is supposed to be serving as a blueprint to the EU Commission on the role that digital technologies can play in enabling these sort of circular principles, circular economic principles, while ensuring that the principles of equity and inclusivity are embedded and centered. And so really exciting to have this conversation. A few housekeeping rules as we get into the conversation. These sessions are meant to be a dialogue centered, so please share your comments over the chats. And we'll sort of take all opportunities we can to bring those questions up. The more questions we have, the more engaged we are, the more exciting the session is. So please don't hesitate. Again, it's meant to be a very open, inclusive dialogue. And please raise your hands if there's any burning questions that you have during the middle. Just raise your hands and we can call you on. But as thoughts come up during the session, just put them in the chat window, and I'll make sure to bring them up after the presentations. So without further delay, Tim, Steffen, I would like to welcome you on. Thank you so much again for joining us. If you can just start off with a brief introduction of yourselves and fire away with the presentations.
Sure, thank you. Shall I start with the introduction, Tilman, and then you follow? Well, just shortly. My name is Steffen Lange. I work, well, actually, I just started working at the University of Münster. I used to work at the Technical University in Berlin together with Tilman. And I've been doing a lot of work on digitalization and sustainability in the past. Apart from that, I work on issues like green growth, post-growth, rebound effects. Tilman.
Thank you, and hello everyone. Yeah, I'm Tilman, Santarius, Santarius, however you want to pronounce it in your countries. It's a pretty Latin name, but I'm German as well, like Steffen. We used to collaborate since 6 years in the realm or on the topic of digitalization and sustainability with a research group that started out in 2016, and now we've conducted this second project together, the dialogue that Steffen is going to present to you in a second, in which outcome the report we're talking about today. In my previous research life, I have worked for the Wuppertal Institute for Climate, Environment and Energy and for the University of California, Berkeley, and I've worked on topics such as climate policy, UNFCCC mainly, but also on trade policy and globalization before I then started to look into the interface of digitalization and sustainability. And I'm a professor now at the Technical University of Berlin.
Okay, shall I start the presentation?
Please.
Shivam, we give a 10 to 15-minute presentation on the report, and then we have the discussion, and afterwards we have the 2 deep dives into circularity and consumption, right?
Sounds great. Sounds great.
All right. Yes, and I say in a minute who is we, where we published in the end of September this report called Digital Reset, Redirecting Technologies for the Deep Sustainability Transformation. And I think the title already says, points out the two aspects that I want to emphasize. So the first hypothesis or the first message of this report is that we need to redirect technologies because so far digital technologies do not really contribute to social and environmental sustainability. And the second point that we make is that in order to redirect them, we need to align digital technologies with a deep transformation. And I find this concept of a deep transformation very helpful because the idea is that so far, our global economy has experienced one deep transformation, and that was the one going along with the Industrial Revolution, so already quite some time ago. And the hypothesis, not from us, but from other authors working on the deep transformation or the deep transition, is that now, in particular regarding the sustainability challenges, we need a second deep transformation. And comparing this with what happened in the Industrial Revolution shows that it's no small thing. So it's not only new technologies, it's new political institutions, it's a new way how to organize our economies. It's certainly new individual habits, new individual behaviors. So it's really a deep, fundamental transformation that we are looking at. As I promised, this is who wrote the report. You see Tilman and myself here, and about a dozen other, mostly scientists, some civil society actors, people from NGOs across Europe we come from. And we've been working in this project that Tilman mentioned for 2 years now, where we basically discussed in a very interdisciplinary manner, discussed the issue of digitalization and sustainability, and the report is the main outcome. We also have a couple of discussion papers, but the report really is the synthesis of it all. And what we do in the report and what Tilman and I are going to do shortly here is 4 steps. So first we argue why digitalization has to be redirected. We first have to explain why, in order to then explain in the second and third step how we can redirect it. And the second step makes up, I think, the biggest part of the report that goes into different sectors and explains how digitalization can help sustainability in agriculture, and then in the energy transition, in the mobility transition, in industry and others. And we're going to talk later today, we're going to have the deep dives in industry and in consumption. Third part is how to make the digital economy, so in particular also big business, sustainability oriented. And fourth is lodestars, so 10 guiding stars or lodestars, how to align digitalization with the deep transformation. So shortly, why digitalization needs to be redirected, and I'm going to make this really short. So we first broaden up the perspective and say, okay, what do we have in mind when we talk about sustainability and digitalization? And we had in mind the fact that we have multiple crises, that we have growth orientation in our economies, that many economies are characterized by overconsumption, that still we have almost entirely linear economies, and we have increasing environmental inequality. So those are fundamental sustainability challenges. And on top of that, due to digitalization, we have another 5 central challenges, which are monopolies, in particular in digital economies, power asymmetries, where big firms or countries have a lot of power, polarization of income and of opportunity, surveillance. So you're all familiar with this problem of the possibility of surveillance due to digitalization, and appropriation of commons, where the basic aspect is that big tech firms profit a lot from public goods, but they don't really contribute, for example, via paying substantial taxes. So this, just to give you an idea, this is the broad picture that we had in mind. where we started from and where we tried to find solutions to. And then we look a bit deeper into the relationship between digitalization and environmental sustainability. And here there's by now actually quite some scientific evidence that digitalization is a double-edged sword. So this, still from my perspective, it is often assumed in publications, in public discourse, when you listen to businesses and politicians talking on panels, that there are kind of automatic positive contributions of digitalization. And this is really not what we find empirically. And this is due to 4 effects. So there were 2 major effects how digitalization helps the environment, and 2 major effects how it harms the environment. And the two positive effects how it helps is efficiency and substitution. So efficiency, this digitalization can help efficient energy efficiency in industrial production, in precision farming, etc., etc. And the substitution aspect is what we're doing here right now. So we have a video conference instead of traveling somewhere else. And the point is, yes, these are potentials, but they are not used and they are not realized to such an extent that I think many hope they would be. So the 2 positive aspects are smaller than hoped for. The 2 negative ones are, I think we are all familiar with the environmental footprint of ICT devices. Around 3% of global greenhouse gas emissions are due to ICT and the internet, just to give you one number. And the second negative aspect are rebound and induction effects. So digitalization leading in particular in high-income countries. So maybe I should have said this from the start. Our report really takes a European perspective and is for European policymakers, etc. And there we have a lot of increase in consumption due to, for example, online shopping. So these 4 aspects together lead to the result that digitalization is a double-edged sword. And then, of course, the question is, okay, but how can we make it a driver or at least part of a sustainability transformation that we need? And for that, we developed this perspective. And this is kind of, I would say, a summary of the line of argument that we make in the report. So we start at the status quo on the left-hand side. And what we need is this transformation, which is illustrated by the arrow at the top, leading to the deep sustainability transformation. And this is very abstract. So what we do is we look at 6 different sectors and point out how these sectors can use digital technologies to bring about the transformation that we need in each of these sectors. And then on the bottom left, you see the challenges that I already pointed out. And at the bottom right, you see principles. And these principles we developed as kind of guiding. They are guiding principles that can be followed in each sector in order to transform them and use digitalization for that. And just shortly on the principles, because that's the overall perspective, and then Tilman is going to talk about the sectors, and afterwards we're going to deep dive into 2 of them. So we have 7 principles, and the first one is really on the design. So one important aspect is how are technologies actually designed and how is this design process being done. So that's regenerative design. The next 3 are mostly on the environmental aspect. So we need system innovations instead of incremental changes in order to bring about the transformation in the sectors that we need. We need not only sufficiency, but also sufficiency and circularity. And digitalization can help quite a bit on that. I will talk about that in a second in the industrial sector. So those are the 3 environmental principles. And then we have 3 more socioeconomic principles, which is sovereignty. So people and also businesses should have control over the data. Resilience, we need to use digitalization to make us more resilient, in particular regarding the economic crisis and the war, the Russian war in Ukraine that we have at the moment. We need to use it to increase resilience rather than becoming more vulnerable, for example, due to cyber attacks. And the last one, equity, as I said, polarization is at the moment the outcome of digitalization a lot of times, so we need to embed it into a more equitable society. Those are the 7 principles, and now I turn over to Tilman to get into the sectors.
Thanks, Steffen. Yes. So basically, the remaining part, the main part of our report is structured into 2 more big chapters and then the final one. And the first bigger chapter, actually the biggest one, is chapter 2 or part 2, as Steffen already said. And here we discuss in detail how digitalization can support sectoral transformations. And on the next slide, you'll see that we look into these sectors because we believe that they are very relevant with regard to sustainability transformations. And we define an overall direction for each sector. How can digital technologies help bring a transformation about? We implement or discuss how to implement the principles that Steffen just mentioned. And finally, we provide more or less specific policy options, how then this could be put into practice. And just to give you an idea, and I'm not going to run through all the sectors right now. For instance, in agriculture, we first of all take stock of the kind of digitalization that is mainly taking place in agriculture, and where we witness that this is the emergence of farm information systems and mainly technologies for precision farming that are devoted to large-scale, high capital input industrial farming, whereas the direction we should be looking at in terms of SDGs and our 7 principles would rather be to outline how digital technologies can support a transformation towards locally adapted ecological farming practices that place the well-being and human rights of small-scale farmers in their rural communities at the heart of the endeavor. So this is sort of part of the analysis and part of the solution, and then we suggest some key policy routes here. As I said, I'm not going to look into the other sectors, not even with those few sentences, because we are later today in the session look at industry and consumption more deeply. So Steffen, please switch to the next one. And part 3 of the report is not looking at the sectors and the sustainability policies in the sector, but rather looks at the governance of digitalization itself. You could also say the ICT sector, but governance of digitalization is much more than the ICT sector. It's also platform governance or AI, artificial intelligence, or data governance, or as we'll show, businesses. And this part 3 of the report, next slide, please, is structured into 4 chapters, actually. One on the very question of infrastructure and devices, the second one on business models, the third one on data governance, and the 4th one on AI. And I will look into very briefly here into at least 2 of them. And I'll start with the infrastructure and devices one. And here is sort of our overall perspective, which is a no-brainer, basically. The social and environmental impacts of producing and operating devices, infrastructures, data centers must be reduced. It's a no-brainer, I say, because everybody will know that it's not very sustainable how a smartphone comes about or how a data center is equipped. We are far from having materials, let alone all the high-tech components that are produced in a circular fashion. I mean, I can't even see that within the next 20 or 30 years that this is all produced in a circular fashion. So that's why we say, okay, it should be reduced. What's happening right now is the opposite. You can see that from numbers indicating global electricity consumption, the graph on the right-hand side here, that global electricity consumption is forecasted to increase by roughly 80% until 2030, just from the ICT sector itself. And now you can argue, okay, maybe we need some more digitalization to help make it a contributing factor in reducing impacts in all these sectors. That is right. But nevertheless, the political endeavor, the societal endeavor should be to reduce the impacts as much as possible. We suggest a combined strategy of increasing efficiencies, slightly increasing circularity, and also of establishing concepts and regulations for digital sufficiency. And you could explicate those in the various parts of the ICT sector. Take, for example, the communication networks. A strategy for sufficiency would be to avoid too many systems in parallel. And we have that in many cities or urban areas, that too many, for example, network providers and telecommunication stations and so are run in parallel, whereas a kind of roaming, not only international roaming, but national roaming would much help to reduce redundancies here. Or, for example, you could regulate for joint use of base stations by different network operators. And of course, another strategy for for sufficiency would be to make sure that systems do not become obsolete prematurely. Now we're still installing 5G systems while other people are already talking about 6G. So how long are these 5G systems considered to work and to operate? And what happens with 3G, 4G, etc.? So I think a good strategy is also to engage more strongly to make sure that lifetime of those communication networks components is maximized. Another view could be on data centers. Okay, a very important aspect because data centers are mushrooming everywhere in the world. Mainstreaming labels, such as in Germany, we have a Blue Angel label for energy efficient data centers. Mainstreaming those labels would be interesting. Or extend the labels to include aspects for operation and disposal of data centers, or for setting minimum standards for the utilization of waste heat, would be very interesting. I personally, and I think we write that in the report, Steffen, please help me, I think that all new data centers should be mandated to be 100% climate neutral without using compensation mechanisms. Okay, and when it comes to devices, again, enabling longer lifetimes, make sure that hardware companies maybe shift their business models from selling ever more devices rather towards renting out devices. Could be interesting. And more aspects on the devices side. I'm moving on here due to time reasons. When I talk about shifting business models, this of course is not only a good aspect for hardware companies, but also for the big platforms, the big tech companies, the Alphabets, Meta, Microsoft, Apple, the big Asians one like Alibaba, Tencent, all those big companies. And the problem is that those big tech business models are currently the main driving force of the environmental footprint of the ICT sector. On the next slide, you see that just by looking at the examples of Alphabet and Meta, the energy use of those companies is pretty much coupled to their turnover. Now, this is the case while they are having tremendous efficiency improvements in their hyperscale data centers, right? Still, the turnover is increasing, fair enough, if they do a good job, but the energy use and related less so, but also the emissions are on the rise. And for the big companies, and these are just two examples here, for the big companies, they are much steeper on a rise than for the rest of the digital economy. So the big companies really drive much of the data transfers, of the energy use, of the service consumptions. So we need to think about how to address these challenges. And we suggest in our report a triple strategy: look at monopoly law to curtail the tremendous market and political power that these companies already have. Secondly, design the right framework conditions that the incentives for the companies are not drive consumption of digital services all the time, but rather provide more sustainable services. And thirdly, support alternatives. like publicly or civil society run platforms and services, or smaller cooperatives that use or practice business models that are more driven towards the common good than just towards driving profit maximization. Okay, on the third chapter on governance of data and the fourth chapter of our AI, I'm not looking at this. I'm rather finishing up. Steffen, I have to jump this due to time reason. I'm finishing up with giving you an idea of some of our 10 lodestars of the final summary or concluding chapter of the report. As we said, we have 10 lodestars. I'm just mentioning 3 here. So the first one is sort of an overarching conclusion. The major technological advances of today are not really geared towards solving the pressing social and environmental challenges. For instance, why is artificial intelligence used to trick consumers into staying longer on social media rather than solving climate change? And I know we're beginning to develop AI solutions for climate change, but these are in the niche, and the main advances are driven towards other purposes. So digital technologies can contribute to tackling those societal challenges, but only if decision makers and society at large develops a clear vision of how those digital technologies should put into the service of providing decent living conditions for all within the planetary boundaries. Okay, that's kind of like the first overarching lodestar. And the fourth one, I'm mentioning that because it's a bit more specifical. We believe, or we come from the insight that I guess most of you will share, policymaking has been lagging behind, far behind technological progress, right? And maybe this is always the case, but we believe that policymakers can do a better job to get ahead of the tech curve in order to drive innovations towards the common good before they become walled off proprietary markets or create new lock-ins into unsustainable production or consumption patterns. Now, this requires strong new institutions that provide sort of anticipatory governance. Technological developments should be supervised more carefully and more systematically over time. And we suggest, as one option, that national governments could establish maybe sector-specific advisory councils for science, technology, and innovations as independent monitoring committees with the mandate to provide early advice to politics and ensure that the process of designing a technology, running it, etc., is inclusive and driven towards the common good. We have best practice examples here. Such advisory councils have been established in Denmark and in the Netherlands, and I think it appears worthwhile learning from those institutions, adjusting them maybe to other national circumstances, and developing them further. And my concluding remark here is related to our lodestar number 6. A frugal use of digital technologies keeps the footprint at bay. Now, as we said earlier, the production and operation of devices account for a substantial amount of material consumptions, energy demand, greenhouse gas emissions, a growing amount also. And yes, efficiency, durability, repairability, recycling is all key, but also reflection upon the actual requirement of a technology. I think in our digital reset report, we sort of veer away from a let's digitalize everything attitude towards a new mindset based on prudent and on purposeful use of those technologies. Thanks. We'll leave it at this for the overall view or introduction into our report. And I think now we have a space for Q&A, right? And then we'll go back to the sectoral approaches and dive into 2 chapters of the report, Industry and Consumption, later today. Thanks.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Tilman and Steffen. I mean, I'm very excited to dive a bit deeper into the sort of topics that we're talking about. I've got Steffen, if you're online, I would love to sort of have you come on and share your question. I know you had to drop out, but if you're still on here, because you had a couple of questions in the chat window. I don't know if Steffen is still with us, but if not, maybe I can. Oh, I don't think he's with us, but basically the questions that Stefan was resonating were around the balance between the negative impact that the technologies are sort of attributed to and some of the more positive aspects that the technology or the transformations are enabling. Conversations around the role of artificial intelligence, conversation around the role of quantum computing and enabling sort of better greening of the ICT sector, so to speak. It is a balance, isn't it? I mean, any quick comments, Tilman and Steffen, from you two into the balance between some of the negative aspects that we attribute to the role of transformation and technologies versus, you know, them being a force for enabling a bit more positivity. And I feel like it is a balance, but I would love to hear from you about any sentiments you would have around that.
I can go first, Tilman, or yes, I mean that's often or always one of the central questions. I mean, first of all, I want to say it's really difficult to actually say point out the net effect. You know, what is the balance, or what does the balance sheet say? Because it's so complex, and I mean, digital technologies, it's so many different ones, so it's really not that easy. Then when we say, I mean, I think I didn't say that, so we talk about a zero-sum game, which is kind of similar as the double-edged sword. When we talk about that, we mostly refer to energy and greenhouse gas emissions. And that is based on panel estimations for countries. So you look at different countries, 20 countries over 20 years, and the ones that have more digitalization, do they have higher CO2 emissions or lower ones? And there the effects are always quite small. But then you also have the investigations on the micro level, of course. For example, what was surprising for me was a very good study on industrial production in Germany that said that the effect's very small. Okay, so it's difficult. We mostly look at energy and CO2. And regarding AI, I find that quite funny. I mean, there was an example in the chat that I don't really know of using AI for developing new crops, so I don't remember exactly. I mean, there's a lot of talk on AI will help the environment, but we've discussing it a lot, and so far, I mean, there are many applications how it can be used, but none of them seem to us in the research group like game changers. So it's not really like, oh yes, now we have AI, and now we can, due to AI, fundamentally reduce greenhouse gas emissions in traffic or greenhouse gas emissions in housing. I mean, it's incremental, slightly, yes, but it doesn't seem to be game changers as far as I can see.
Interesting. Tilman, any comments from you?
Yes, I could, but maybe Stefan wants to come in here so that we have more of a dialogue.
I don't think Stefan is with us anymore. I believe he had to leave, so he popped the questions and unfortunately had to leave.
Anybody else wants to reply directly? Otherwise, of course, I can say something.
Yeah,
but
I think we've got David and Richard's hand up as well. So yeah, please.
No, I think going back to what Stefan just said, I mean, I think the capacity to do like global scale environmental change monitoring using AI is game changing, at least from a measuring and monitoring perspective. Of course, you then need to generate action from that, but still, I think that ability is unprecedented nowadays. So I do think that should be looked at. And then I guess the question is, how do you take that data from global scale monitoring and drive it into the digital economy so it actually changes behaviors and shifts markets? So I think that's one question. I think the other one that I wanted to talk about is really the idea of, you know, digital nudging or algorithmic nudging, shaping behaviors towards more sustainable lifestyles and helping consumers take better decisions around the products and services they buy. So sort of the empowering aspect, the enabling aspect for more sustainable consumption. In my view, that is there. There's a lot of opportunity there. And so I'd just like to hear, you know, what is the research telling you, and you know, how can we look at those two aspects of the positive side of it? Thanks.
Maybe can I jump in then? Thanks so much, David. And I think we need to make a difference first between the analysis of what is taking place, and second, of potential game changers and potential contributions or risks, but also contributions to the good sides, as you say. And so when it comes to the to the analysis of the status quo, as Steffen said, I mean, it's hard to make a final statement here because it's just too vast and data is very hard to get for all aspects. And digitalization is such a big toolbox. I mean, it's hard to find the boundaries of the system, right? But in terms of the analysis, we don't see very many game changers being in place yet. So that is why we say we need much more ambitious policymaking and shaping of digitalization in order to make those come to the fore. Now, when it comes, okay, that's analysis, right? And please come back, David, and tell me where there is already the game changers underway that we can see in the statistics. Now, when it comes to the potentials, I fully agree. And I think our report has a number of suggestions how we can apply certain digital technologies and applications, including AI. And we'll come back to that on consumption. Just as you said, nudging will be an issue I will raise in 10, 15 minutes when we go into that sector. Again, here, I mean, let's get the big picture. I am developing an AI-based nudging tool to help users on a search engine that we're collaborating with to find more sustainable product alternatives. And it's a project cooperation between 2 universities and a search engine. And we're trying this out, but it's really hard, to make it a game changer, even for that small search engine. So it will not come in 2, 3, 5 years. So we're experimenting. We're doing behavioral science research. We're doing laboratory tests, A/B testing, etc. We're trying out the new AI search recognition tools and etc. So it's hard work, and at the same time, others are fine-tuning and optimizing AI tools for advancing consumption, and for perfectionating online advertisement. So we always need to keep the big picture. I think it's not an either or. Let's more look at the good sides or let's more look at the bad side. But I think this is taking place in parallel. And we should address all of that. And I think we need regulation for the risks and support and much scaling up of the potentials.
I've got a few comments on that one, but maybe I'll invite Richard to come into the conversation. Richard has got his hand up. So Richard, please, I'll invite you into the conversation and we can build upon this dialogue, or if you've got another question, please go for it.
Right. Can you hear me? I'm having a little trouble with the, okay. 40 years at the UN before COVID on a daily basis as an NGO. So I know the system. David mentioned the tech envoy and the role he could play in coordination through the system. However, are you in touch with the Department of Global Communications academic impact? If you want a large bang for your buck or euro, it would really perhaps seem to be a logical thing to contact 1,400 universities and maybe start with a questionnaire. Thank you.
Thanks for the comment.
I think it's Richard. Yeah, thank you. I think this is something definitely that all of us in this space are trying to do more and more, which is increase the amount of collaboration and avoid sort of increase our capacity to reach out to more stakeholders who are undertaking similar kinds of work and be as collaborative and less redundant as we can be in our approaches to enable these outcomes for sure. I think given the time, I think it'll be wise to move on to the next phase of the conversation, which is a bit more gets into the guts of the conversation, and then we can sort of continue the dialogue on through questions. So maybe Steffen and Tilman, I'll leave it back to you to sort of get into the next phase of the conversation, and then we can keep the questions on after.
Wonderful. That goes to me. Tilman does the next one. I do the one on industry and circularity. So, okay. So just to put it in context again, as we said, as Tilman said, we go into in the report, we go into different sectors, and now in this session we want to go into 2 ones, and I'm going to talk about the industrial production or the industry sector. And I only have one slide, so I think it's good, now before we had a lot of slides. Now I hope you can just follow me verbally. So industry. First, I want to mention again, this is again quite a European perspective. That's what the report was mainly focusing on. And when we look at the European industry, the concepts for decarbonizing the industry will go along with a very strong increase in electricity demand, so electricity compared to other energy sources. So that's one challenge or one aspect that we have to keep in mind when we talk about how to make industry sustainable. The second one that of course we should have in mind at the moment are the historical circumstances of coming out of the COVID-19 crisis. I already mentioned Russia's war in Ukraine and the energy crisis in Europe, also elsewhere, that we have at the moment. And also, I would say a changed perspective on the reliability of global supply chains due to both crises that I just mentioned. So with this in mind, we need a strategy for system innovations. So really, not only incremental, but fundamental changes in how industry is being organized that fosters resilience and also circularity and sufficiency. That's what we argue. So not only circularity, but also sufficiency. Why is that? As I said, in general, there are high hopes for digitalization, but in particular regarding industry, I would say, to improve sustainability. So a couple of buzzwords are Industry 4.0 in Germany, the industrial internet in the US, made in China 2025, already a couple of years back in China. However, and I already cited that study before, when we look at the empirical evidence that we see, digital technologies don't fundamentally or substantially reduce electricity consumption or energy consumption in industrial production. This is even less so in these studies when we consider that along with digitalization go a change in supply chains. So what we see is that firms that have more digitalization actually have more products, energy intensive products being produced elsewhere, not in Europe, and that is maybe more of a statistical aspect that was very interesting here. So the question is how to make use of digital potentials, which digital potentials are there in industry, which risks, and how to reply to that, how to respond to that. And as I said, it needs to be a combination between circularity and sufficiency, because even if you make everything very, very circular, due to this immense increase in electricity demand that goes along with decarbonization.
Hey,
somebody has the video. Somebody has the mic on. Can you turn it off, please? Okay, so combination of circularity and sufficiency. And I think circularity, is very well known. From my perspective, it's if not the concept of how to reorganize industrial production, certainly in the EU. And the basic connection between digitalization and circularity is that digital tools bring about all the data that we need to organize an economy in a circular manner. And for that, I give you the one slide that I already promised. Here's the one slide. I hope you can see it. That's also from the report. So in the middle, you see data is being collected, it's being used, and it's being shared. Okay, I'm not going to go into that. What I'm interested in here is the outer circle, which is the life cycle. And here the point is that data, digitalization, bringing about data, can help in all the aspects of the life cycle. So in design, we have 3D modeling that can help designing the products. But also, and I think even more interesting, we can get the information of how the product has to be designed so that it can be recycled afterwards. So I know an example from packaging even in Europe and globally even more, it's really difficult for firms to actually know how to make the packaging in order that they can be recycled in the countries, because they all have different recycling systems. So digitalization can help the companies to get this information. Then in production, the most important point is to actually produce also the data, so that in further phases of the life cycle it can be used, but also labeling, so that firms actually know what labels are there and what data they need to prepare, and what guidelines they have to follow in order to get those sustainability labels. That's in production. In usage, the most important point regards products that actually use energy or electricity. So here, monitoring of energy consumption becomes possible due to digitalization, and therefore also at least potentially the ability to reduce the usage where it actually needs a lot of energy. And then the small circle is second life, which I find very important from a sustainability perspective. So digitalization and data enable repair and maintenance because it gives the information. So, for example, businesses that want whose business model is repairing, they need the information how the product is being designed in order to actually repair. And then the last one, recycling, that's closely related to the production phase. So when you have the information how the product is being produced, it becomes much more feasible to recycle an increasing amount of products, of goods. Maybe I stop sharing at this point and keep on talking instead. I just want to mention in the EU, there are two central policy initiatives related to this data in circular economy. And I guess many of you know them. So one is the digital product passport that exactly tries to provide all this data that I just talked about. And the second one is the supply chain, the due diligence law. Sorry, that puts pressure on companies in order to follow sustainability measures also along the supply chain. And this relation is very interesting because it shows, I think, on a general basis for the industry how data and law needs to go hand in hand, because the digital product passport that can allow the data that is needed, but it doesn't suffice. Firms also need the incentive to actually use the data for sustainability purposes, and the supply chain law actually brings about the incentives or the regulation that firms need to follow it, and then they actually use the data for that purpose. That's regarding circularity. As I said, the second aspect is sufficiency. So even with full use of digital technologies for circularity in industry, reaching the necessary reduction targets of greenhouse gas emissions would be very challenging. That's the case for sufficiency. And what's sufficiency? I think in this case, there's quite some overlap with circularity because repairing and reusing is part of sufficiency, but it also means limitations to the expansion of industrial production. And here, how to get there? Again, the right policies would go a long way. So I think for me, as an environmental economist, that's it's an old tale. So we need to make the use to limit the use of natural resources and emissions, and there its price will go up, and that will bring about a lot of incentives to for new business models that focus on repairing and focus on providing the data that I just talked about, etc. And here it becomes broader. Then comes the interesting question of what about jobs and what about finances, in particular for social welfare systems. And so the fear is that a lot of jobs will disappear and what then happens to the people or the communities where these sectors or the big firms are that will reduce in size. And I think that's one of the major challenges during the sustainability transformation that lies ahead, at least in Europe. But we must not forget that yes, there would be jobs that disappear in the transformation to the circular economy and the transformation to a sufficient economy. But there are also a lot of new business models and jobs that would appear. I already talked about repairing, recycling, etc. So and they are often very labor intensive. So I think the crucial role for politics and policies would be to actually organize this transformation, organize so that the new jobs are well paid and have good working conditions, and to have a strong social welfare system to take care of the people who lose within this process. That's the big role, I think, for policies. And with that, I stop. That is our take on industry and circularity and sufficiency in industry, and I'm looking forward to the debate and the questions.
Steffen, thank you so much. I think for me, I think the key things that stand out again from my own sort of experience and expertise, and from what you are sharing as well, based on your research and the paper as well, is there is certainly a massive opportunity for technologies to, particularly when it comes to industries and their supply chains, the ability to leverage the power of data to enable a certain level of transparency that can then drive better circular decisions across the supply chain, across a different industry. I think that's an opportunity that stands out again and again in a very strong way. I think what's also nice to hear is the fact that while this new circular models might replace some of our existing ways of functioning in the industry, there is an opportunity to replace them with something better. And of course, any transition will demand a shift in the labor market, shift in the labor profile. But I feel like that is where, from what I'm hearing, we need to focus a lot of our collective efforts on. But the key message being that technologies do have a role to play in sort of very critical, rather, through leveraging data to enable a lot of this transparency in the supply chain. So that's very promising, I would say. Sort of any questions that pop up for anybody else? I would want to first take the opportunity to see if anybody has any questions, please. If you can raise your hand, and or maybe just shoot some message in the chat. In the meanwhile, Elias, hi Elias, nice to have you with us here. You made a very interesting comment about the digital product passports, which is also very much along the lines of enabling sort of supply chain transparency, and a very cool idea that the EU is also working on. Maybe Elias, if you don't mind, would you be open to coming on and sharing just a couple of sentences around that, and just maybe spurring some thoughts on the importance of this DPP or digital product passports and the role technologies are playing in this?
And It's great to get Elias on here because he is part of the authors of the report.
Yeah, but
sorry,
so
part of the project behind the.
I have chosen not to be author because this is directed to us, so I would undermine the whole story. So anyway, it was real fun to work with you guys. So we were 15 people brainstorming over a year and a half, and a lot of long days of discussions. I think there was a lot of collateral kind of findings that are difficult to capture in one report. But the most kind of the one that was really said by Tilman was, how do we avoid that digitalization actually is not used in a wrong direction? Because there is a lot of good intentions, but when it comes to deployment and application of precision farming, for example, with all the good intentions, it normally ends up to be a nightmare. It drives, industrialization. It increases inequality. It doesn't really compensate for all the gadgets that you throw around. You don't really get net positive effect. So the governance is something that needs to be put in place, and that's where people lose. The markets are not kind of designed to provide public goods. It's more like a private good. And their ICT is kind of strengthening that fundamental thing instead of fighting it off. So we have some fundamental things we need to talk about. So now on DPP, one thing we're trying to say is the following, that while most of the eyes are looking at carbon and climate change is associated with these pictures of factories that are producing electricity burning coal. The reality where the really problem is when it comes to climate change is a non-circularity of our economy, because we need to excavate, produce, manufacture, transport, use, burn, shred all these products over and over and over. And those are emissions that are as big, if not bigger than, talking renewables versus coal versus gas versus oil. So this is the missed kind. We have a blind eye to that, okay, as a society. And this non-circularity is huge because there is no right incentives to the economic actors. So economic actors are incentivized to make money by selling quantities of something, quantities of cars, quantities of mobile phones, quantities of pesticides, quantities of buildings. So everything is, profit is tightly tied with the quantity of something, of natural resource, because that's not valued very well. Huh? And now, how do we decouple so profitable business can exist by other things than tidying it up with the quantity of something? So we need to move to this kind of what we call sustainable business models, where everything is a service. So I, as a company, can make money by selling 3 times the same phone, like with HPE. The profit margin of selling refurbished server is bigger than selling new server. Can you imagine that the circularity can be very profitable and still in a decoupling mode? And that's what for that we need a lot of information. So if you want manufacturers and the economic actors to move to extended product ownership, instead not extended product responsibility only, to go to ownership and leasing models and services models, they need situational awareness. What is happening to their owned products? What is the performance level, where it is, what is the status, when it's reaching the end of life? How can I program next year how much will come through recycling as recycled material? So all that awareness is not there. That's why it's cheaper to order primary material, manufacture, and let society deal with the waste. It's not my problem. It's so easy for them like that. So to really get there, you need to make it really profitable and really easy to navigate through information space. As I said, the situational awareness is what Digital Product Passport wants to do. It wants to give me as manufacturer situational awareness. What is coming my supply chain? Where are my products and how they are hitting me back? And why are they repaired so often? I mean, why are they ending their life much sooner than what I designed them for? All that is a good feedback for me to redesign and make sure that I get my experience, consumer experience, much better. So in nutshell, it's what UNFCCC is always saying. Let's try to find ways to address the societal needs with less materials. And so we are not saying, let's get out of our comfort zone. Let's forget what we need as humanity. We can still serve our needs, but it doesn't need to be tied with material consumption.
Yeah.
And for that, digitalization is the only, it's a necessary tool. Okay.
Yeah, I think that's incredibly important. I think maybe Tilman, I'll get back to you. Yeah, please, if you can quickly, because just in the interest of time, a quick response from you, and then we can go on with the question.
Just a very quick one. I mean, excellent, Elias, what you all say, and we've been discussing this back and forth during our intensive dialogue. I fully agree with everything what you say, and I just want to add that, of course, this idea of making those circular business cases more profitable also goes far beyond of any digital governance. It's more or less the old question how to internalize external costs, right?
Absolutely.
And here we are now in a situation with the Ukraine war that is not very famous and popular to talk about raising carbon or energy or material prices. But in the end, this is one solution, going back to the digital governance, that creates the right framework conditions also for those digital business cases.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's an interlapping conversation, right? I mean, it's intersecting conversation where governance dictates the role and the outcomes. But I think going back to governance, just quickly, Sophie had a very important question in the chat where, we're talking sort of about this frameworks and what needs to be done. It's a moving scale because as time passes on, especially the pace at which the technologies are evolving is quite a bit rapid. Like you said, the policymakers aren't keeping tabs. Some would argue that they're being informed by tech on the policies to be made, which is not, again, in the favor of the environment. So if you, Tilman and Steffen, if you were to highlight just very quickly again from your research and expertise, a couple of really urgent actions that need to be taken now, one or two that come to mind that are, you would say, as the most important. And I know that's it's a poorly framed question because all are equally important, but if you can just sort of highlight your top thoughts on where you need to put the emphasis on.
Should I start? And we can both do one.
One each.
Yeah, just one
each.
One
each, but also
Okay.
quickly because we need to get to Tilman's presentation as well. So
okay, I think the most important one that is also not tightly connected to digitalization and therefore maybe easiest the one that Tilman just said, because we if external costs are internalized, then also that brings a big change on how digital technologies are being used. And the other field, sorry, it's not one policy, but the other field I think is really regarding then specific digital devices, and then you have different policies for service or for infrastructure or for the end user devices.
And I would like to add, I think we should unleash the potential of data, in particular for the circularity. I mean, Steffen was pointing at this, and there's not one-off solution here, but I think what's really needed is a set of new institutions, organizations even, that are taking the historical step of moving even more into an information-driven economy or a data-driven, big data-driven economy as a starting point, and that have their responsibility mainly in setting up data that is relevant for sustainability reasons, making sure that access and usability of that data is optimized, and maybe also some kind of benefit sharing for those who can build good business cases on sustainability data, on circularity, as Ilya said, like who's going to benefiting, how can these companies sort of pay back the use of that data commonly provided or provided as a public common, so that it becomes sort of an upward cycle, a virtuous cycle, that ever more data-based business cases can contribute to circularity or sharing or efficient production, etc.
Thank you for that. Maybe Tilman, I'm sure there's more questions that will come up, but I think we should move on to your part of the presentation, and then maybe perhaps we can have another couple of 10 minutes or so for some conversations.
Cool, of course. And let me switch the light on. It's getting dark in Germany here, winter time. I don't know where you guys are at. Sometimes some other places probably the sun is rising right now. So let's skip or let's change the topic and turn towards the sector of consumption. It's not really a sector, right? But because consumption is already taking place in mobility or in agriculture and food. But we're talking about the consumption here in a way of goods and services, right? And end user consumption, not B2B. And the starting point, similar to what Steffen said about the industry sector, the starting point for a deep and sustainable transformation is consumption patterns have to change accordingly. Okay, this has already been enshrined actually in the Millennium Development Goals, again in the SDGs, not talking any new business here. And the main pathways to achieve that change are more efficient lifestyles, using less resources for the same desires and needs, a more sufficient lifestyle, using less consumption overall to have a decent and happy life, a good life, and of course more circularity, co-production of consumption, disposal. We've talked about that already. Now in practice, this means avoiding overconsumption in the global north. We call this overconsumption, what means that people already have too much stuff in their homes that they can't even use, all these things, you know it. Avoiding that overconsumption and shifting to more socially and environmentally sustainable products and services globally. right? And digitalization has considerable potential to contribute towards sustainable consumption. For instance, by providing more useful and accessible information on sustainable product and service choices, or by enabling access to long-lasting, high-quality products rather than short-term fashion, and ever shorter production and consumption cycles, and by facilitating the possibilities to avoid consumption or at least shopping of new devices by sharing, swapping, renting. But let's look at the big picture first before I come to 4 solutions. The big picture, and I'm sorry, David, Stefan, and others, I have to spend a minute again on the downside of the kind of mainstream digitalization that is ongoing at the moment, and also in the last 2 decades, at least. Because before, digitalization was not so much consumption oriented. Only since the late 90s, beginning of the 2000s, digitalization really got this consumption focus, right? At the moment, digitalization is rather increasing than decreasing consumption. And the share of sustainably produced items is not growing significantly, not even with the major shift towards e-commerce and more digital consumption during COVID-19. And this is mainly due, I just say one issue because we have to address it. One issue, this is mainly due to the business cases of large digital companies. Advertising revenue is often part of the central financing model of tech companies, with Alphabet and Meta gaining the largest share by far. And this makes the big tech companies having a particular interest in making advertisement as effective as possible. Worldwide media advertisement spending has risen on 5% each year, now hit the $700 billion per year. More advertisement money is spent on media and digital than on analog, billboard advertisement. And accordingly, the research, our own empirical research, and as well as surveys and market studies by others, have shown that increased effectiveness of personalization in advertisement, retargeting, individual pricing techniques, etc., leads to more shopping overall. The level of consumption of commerce is linked to the effectiveness of those advertisements. So that's why we need to address it. But instead of further increasing consumption, I think we should use digital tools to avoid, shift, and improve, make better consumption. How can we achieve this? As I said, 4 issues. The 4th one will be regulating advertisement. The 3 ones are more positive, I say, okay? First, I think we suggest to more systematically develop and publicly support the establishment of independent, trustworthy, consumer-friendly recommendation systems. Sustainability recommendation systems can help consumers cut through the information noise and the label maze, what kind of product is sustainable? Is it green or is it not green? Is it greenwashing? They can help consumers cut through that maze, and scientifically based, transparently gained rating approaches, evaluation of product choices, ideally with interactive consumer advice, as well as up-to-date product tests and so on, can help raise the share of sustainably produced items. As I said earlier, my research group is developing a green consumption assistant, and I know that this needs a lot of public support. Building up a green database with dozens of thousands of products in there being rather labeled as more or less or not even at all sustainable, building up an information base of what kind of practices like repairing or sharing can be advised in certain moments of user search on the web, or of in certain moments when people are about to shop new items. This is a research endeavor and it needs public support because it's not coming about automatically. And also for experimenting with the modes, how to effectively inform and even nudge, voluntarily, but nudge consumers towards taking the opportunity of those recommendation systems. I think that's also something that needs to be improved, better developed. So first suggestion is the recommendation systems for sustainability. Second, we believe, this is not very new, I make it shorter, that sharing, swapping, renting apps or platforms can significantly reduce the transaction costs and improve the information level of consumers, how they can avoid consumption of new items. And I think here it's mainly local communities, cities, maybe subnational state governments that can do a great job by promoting such platforms, or by eventually even developing their own versions of local sharing and marketplaces, such as local commerce platforms that connect local vendors with consumers and offer low carbon delivery modes. And there's a lot of communities already experimenting with such local commerce platforms, with local marketplaces, with a version of eBay that allow for peer-to-peer sharing, you know, not the main eBay, but the local one. And I think this needs to be scaled up, supported, and also we need information exchange between the communities, the cities that are experimenting with these things. Some work better than others, some have been put out of practice, others are flourishing. So here, having sort of like an information platform for those policymakers to exchange their learnings would be helpful. Third is, do I still have time? Yes, it's 1:15. Third, I think government regulation can help to improve availability, accessibility, affordability of sustainable products. For instance, extended product warranties can incentivize producers to offer longer lasting products. France has established a repairability label. Sweden is experimenting with a reduction in VAT, in value-added tax, on repair services. The European Commission, Elias and our colleagues, is currently considering legislation to establish a right to repair, so that small-scale repair services, or even individuals, you know, who are able to do this, are enabled to repair electronic devices and other things. So I think there's a bunch of policy and regulation options that can help improve availability, access to, and also price, affordability of sustainable products. And then finally, and I said that links back to the online advertisement problem, I think we need stricter rules for ads. The manipulation potential of personalized profiling for commercial uses should be limited. In the European Union, we have the General Data Protection Regulation. There's good principles in there, like data sufficiency and coupling. I don't know the English word, Kopplungsverbot, coupling restrictions or so of you're only allowed to raise or collect the data that is needed for the service that you're offering, and not additional data that you're later on selling. So these principles are enshrined in the EU General Data Protection Regulation, but it's not really sought after. There's a huge difference between what is practiced and what is in those principles. And I think many other countries don't even have those principles. So I think we need more strict regulation here from the side of privacy and data sovereignty. And I believe also, maybe I should put that at this point here, I believe that the green versus privacy is also a false dichotomy. Consumer competition authorities should cooperate to avoid sacrificing privacy for green reasons. We don't need the transparent, the glass consumer, you know, in order to achieve sustainability. Rather, I suggest, or we suggest in the report, that we should reverse the burden of proof for the platforms or for the e-commerce sellers to help put consumers' interests at the core of algorithmic decision making. All right, so to sum up, digital offers multiple opportunities to spur the transformation of consumption practices and increase the share of more sustainable products in the market. We should support all the forerunner companies that purposefully develop green products and responsible marketing. And this needs public information campaigns, the right incentives in place, and also regulation to shift and improve consumption and to make shopping of new items simply superfluous as far as this is possible. Thanks.
Thank you, Tilman. Thank you so much. You're very interesting. I think again, what stands out to me is the importance of policymakers in this whole conversation. It's, I mean, whether that's enabling better financial incentives to be able to reshift the business models that can allow for a lot of these things that you're talking about, because like Elias was saying, also a lot of this is fundamentally tied to how the business model dictates and demands the organizations to work, which is premised on quantitative growth and selling more to consumers. And so sort of the policymakers do really need to play a centralized role in enabling a lot of this, what we're talking about. Sam had a very important question on that. Sam, I would invite you to please come on, if available to you, and share your question around the role that policymakers need to play, and maybe we need to be a bit more stronger in how we enable that or how we market that.
Yeah, hi. No, I think it's very easy to get the wrong kind of regulation that has a whole load of perverse incentives that then do the wrong thing rather than the right thing. And I think there's a ramp to regulation, which is around voluntary code of conducts that tests with an ambitious cadre about what they're prepared to do voluntarily, and then the regulation then pulls the rest of the people through that process. But I'm just thinking that given where UNEP stands on this, if I was to channel my inner Mark Radke, Mark would say we need to be quite careful about where we stand with regulation, because it's not something you need to be very careful about getting it wrong, because that's the greatest risk rather than getting it right. So I think there's an interesting question about rather than working on a set of individual initiatives, could there be even principles for policymakers to consider in the creation of policy rather than policy recommendations specifically? And could there be guidance and steers about where the greatest digital threat to a sustainable planet lies, so there's focus and attention paid in the right areas rather than in the wrong areas? So for me, I think there's like there's concentrations that you could place, like highly concentrated could be a set of regulations and recommendations. Low medium concentration could be a set of principles to think things through that could be adapted in different contexts. And another one could be to work with different sectors on voluntary engagement to support them to do the right thing, that can then inform policy making in that process. So I feel like policy making is critical. We've seen how things are starting to move just by the positioning of the European Union on these things. And I think that's having an accelerant effect on this, where people are starting to get more interested in voluntary opportunities. So David, I think it's an interesting question for UNEP on this, because we've seen lead in petrol, what happened in terms of that process potentially. And I feel like if we feel like the digital economy is the great threat in terms of so many different outcomes, both behavioral, social, environmental, then what could be, with a group of kind of policymaking practitioners, best practice, best guidance, so that policy making is moving in the right direction? And it could be just, we could subcontract this to a strong think tank or a university that has kind of presence and purchase. So it could be the Institute of Government, whatever it might be. So we have a fingerprints-free route on this. It's not seen as UNEP says, but we try and think about what that would look like. So for me, I feel like policy making is the shortest route to potentially the wrong or the right destination, depending what happens. And I'd be curious to work out maybe if there's a more benevolent role we could play in that space.
Any comments from Tilman or Steffen? Elias, you've got your hand up, so.
Maybe just very quickly, Sam, thanks for that. Excellent. And just to correct the impression, I mean, for those 4 areas that I've outlined, I've mentioned what politics can do. But for the first 2, like developing the recommendation agents, and the second one is sort of advancing platforms and apps and so for sharing, swapping, renting, I don't see politics or policymakers in the driver's seat here. I just outlined what they can do to support. I see business, civil society run platforms, science also in the driver's seat here to develop those areas, and to experiment. I think I agree if you meant this, and it's too early to apply some kind of regulation or recommendation systems here. We're not yet there. We need these things first, and experiment with them and see, and then maybe at some point there could be some more strict rule for policy making, but not yet. What now they can support. However, I do see politics in the driver's seat for the stricter rules on online advertisement. And here I think it's more of a battle of the lobby. It's just so much lobby power that's in You know, standing outside of Elias' door while he's sitting here, they're standing outside knocking on his door. Not just kidding, Elias, but you know what I mean. I mean, there's a lot of lobby power ongoing in the capitals of this world. And there's a new study out there showing that the tech companies in the last years have spent more money on lobbying than automobile, chemistry, and pharmaceuticals. You know, this is a lot of money because we know that these three companies have spent quite some. So all on the online advertisement, I think it's a matter of power. And regarding the third thing that I say, like sort of extending warranty times or experimenting with labels or VAT reduction on services or so, here I think it's not so new. We have a lot of experiences, and we have the EU Design Directive already taking steps into that direction. So I think although we're talking about digital devices, maybe we're building on a lot of experience with other product items, and we can take regulation forward from that.
Thank you, Tilman. So Elias, do you want to come in here, please?
Yeah. So I wanted to resonate what Sam said. I very much agree, but I see that Sam is using the word policies and Tilman the politics, and I want to make the differentiation between policies and politics. Commission is one of the few organizations that is trying to do policies based on impact assessments. When politics come in, and politics come in when the trialogue, when the council parliament is trying to finalize the text of a regulation that we come up, suddenly keywords fly in without any, it's just politics after a while. So let's distinguish between policies and politics. Let's try to keep the policies based on some facts and really come in after there are facts established and we know what we're doing. And what Sam was saying, that there are kind of that there are schemes and public-private partnerships and some kind of a soft power schemes that are already working and have a scale power, okay? And that is happening in this space, but it's happening, and I come back to the original question, it's mostly happening to make the companies look good because they are green. So they come together in different schemes to make themselves look good because it sells as marketing. So if we say, what is the biggest power? What is the biggest issues we should look at? That's what Sam, I think, was asking. Is it really the greening of ICT? I would say no. It's the greenwashing, the naive greenwashing we could fall into the trap of what ICT can do. That's why you have to deploy times 10. So the impact of ICT when it comes to electricity consumption and the data centers, telecoms, and e-waste, it's well measured. There are many spotlights on that. So the risk of that going wrong may be less than the risk of the naive kind of storytelling and potential kind of scenarios of how by making the city 5G, digital, or making our economy digital will save all the problems. There, by applying a risk, I would say let's focus to govern the future usage of ICT, because that's where we may have a bigger problem.
Yeah. So maybe just to try and bring all these conversations together into the realm of, again, the role of digital technologies and enabling better sort of models, particularly focused on circularity and consumption, that can then lead to more sustainable outcomes. I think what we're talking about is the need to focus on the governance of these technologies in the right manner so that they can enable some of these things. So I think maybe just a quick comment from you all then. So if that is the conversation, indeed, we've got only 4 minutes left. So any final comments from you all into what could that policy look like? I mean, where could be focused? I mean, if you are to talk about urgent action in the part of policymakers where organizations could push policymakers to enforce some of these things, what could that look like? I mean, because we're talking about a fundamental shift in how organizations operate and how we leverage the role of technology, right?
Steffen, before colleagues come in, let me just jump in. Sorry to jump the queue, but I just want to say this is such an important conversation for the Global Digital Compact. We met with the Tech Envoy this morning. The Digital Compact is going to be negotiated across member states in 2024. The idea is it's a member state-driven compact, and it'll be endorsed and or supported by different tech companies. So it's a critical opportunity to start shaping some of these governance questions around digital technology. And what I would ask is for Tilman and colleagues and the Commission to really start to engage heavily in that process to begin shaping it. Because what I can see from my perspective is that the sustainability aspects of this conversation are not yet fully anchored in that dialogue. So there's a whole series of dialogues ongoing, but sustainability, environmental sustainability, circularity does not seem to be coming up as strongly as I would expect. So that means that we have a constituency, a coordination issue across our constituency. So I think the more we can start to engage in that process and bring these issues up, the better. Thanks.
Can I just say one word, because these are words of Tilman himself, but he forgot maybe this is what we discussed. One policy, kind of very simple policy, is let's push that any legislator that is legislating on green policies, whatever they do on environmental protection, makes sure ex ante impact assessment that they use the up-to-date and fit for purpose digitalization for it. So screen the green policies with digital glasses. Vice versa, any digitalization policy, broadband deployment, and this kind of gigabit networks, and get everybody on the highest possible digital kind of highway, should be screened with green glasses and sustainability glasses, social and environmental. If we achieve that simple thing in a policy, that means ex ante impact assessments, then I think we will go much further than where we are now, where the momentum is everybody is in corner drawing digital impacts, digital policies, digital legislations completely in vacuum without any impact, rather than just last minute kind of a lip service in the introduction of every legislation that, of course, this will serve green digital transition, whatever. You understand? That alone would have already impact, and then we have all the expertise. We need to make a structural change in how we legislate or how we push and how we finance things.
Absolutely. So maybe quick last words. We've got a minute, so maybe quick words from Tilman and Steffen before we sort of depart. Sorry, I know it's an exciting conversation, but we have to honor time. So Tilman, Steffen.
I think I can nicely connect to what Elias just said, and then Tilman, you can have the last words. And I want to connect it to what some asked. So, I mean, it's really difficult to think about what principles exactly to apply to how to or which policies are to be made. But what we develop in the report, and we did have that slide today, is to have three perspectives on this. And I think that helps thinking about it. So one, Elias just pointed out, bring the sustainable into the digital policies. And I think that's something that is really barely being done. The second one we already talked about, reduce the environmental footprint. And I think, still that's very important, the direct environmental footprint of all the devices. And the third one is to really analyze in the policies in each sector where digitalization brings about risks and where it brings about potentials. So this might be how to say, glasses, how to look at perspectives, how to look at the policies.
Excellent. I will use the last 10 seconds just to say that it's interesting that we see the pictures here on the screen. David representing the codes report that came out this year. I mean, with colleagues and many others, of course. Steffen and me with the digital reset report, and Elias, just to mention, I mean, the Commission has taken the effort to advise the Joint Research Center to publish a report this year, again on the same topic. I think with these three weapons, sorry for that language, I think with these three great pieces of mind, we are well equipped to take the endeavor to bring the sustainability more into the digital. In that sense, David, I'm more than happy to contribute. And if there's anything we can do to make the digital compact more sustainably oriented, let us know. Thanks so much for that great discussion and for the opportunity to present today.
Thank you so much. We really appreciate it. I think for others who couldn't get a chance to get the questions, and I think if there are burning questions, Steffen, Tilman, if you're kind enough, we will share them over email with you. But I think for the rest of you, thank you so much for joining. Really appreciate it. If you don't get a chance to connect before, very happy holiday season as well.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, colleagues.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Cheers.
Thanks.
Take care.